Hello and welcome to this Christian Inquiry Agency conversation. It's part of a series of conversations we've been having where we've been looking at important issues and we've been exploring them from a Christian perspective, but very much aware that they matter to a wider audience. So we hope that this will be helpful to a large number of you. Now, you may well be aware, in fact, I'd be surprised if you weren't, that over the first 2 weeks of November, the United Nations Climate Conference, COP26, is happening in Glasgow. And this is looking at really important issues of climate change. And that's going to be the subject of what we're talking about today. I'm Steve Hollinghurst, and I'm one of the trustees of the Christian Inquiry Agency, but I also work for the Anglican Diocese of Lichfield, which is the Church of England in Staffordshire, North Shropshire, and the Black Country. And in that role, I am an evangelism enabler, environmental focus. So I'm very much involved in events around COP26 here in Lichfield Diocese. But our guest today, Dr. Ruth Valerio, who is a Global Advocacy and Influencing Director for Tearfund, is actually in Glasgow, and that's where we welcome her now. Ruth, hello.
Hi, Steve. Very good to see you.
So I wanted to start by asking you a little bit more about your role. You're someone who's worked for a long time in the fields of ecology and environmentalism. But your current role, I think, has quite an emphasis on issues of poverty and helping the world's poor. How do those two things fit together for you?
Yeah, so I work for an organisation called Tearfund, and as you said, I'm up at the COP conferences, but I've managed to, which direction am I looking in? Managed to nip into the Tearfund Scotland office in order to be able to sit somewhere quiet to talk with you. And Tearfund's an organisation, it's an aid and development and advocacy organisation that works in around 50 of the world's poorest countries, working very much with the church and alongside the church and church networks to see the poorest people in our world lifted out of poverty. And environmental concerns, to me, very much marry up with that concern for people living in poverty, because you can't care for people without thinking about the air that they breathe, the seas they fish in, the land that they live off, and you can't care about those different aspects. You can't care about the wider aspects of the natural world without thinking about the people that share those spaces and that cause the damage, whether through extreme poverty or more often through extreme wealth. And the climate crisis really just shows that absolutely that these things go hand in hand. It used to be decades ago that you might be really interested in environmental things, or you might be really interested in poverty, but you just cannot separate those things. As people, we live in the wider natural world, and so if the wider world is suffering, then we will be suffering. So it absolutely goes hand in hand.
And one of the things as I've been looking at what the discussions are around COP26, the obvious front runner is the issue of climate change and reducing fossil fuel output and all that kind of stuff. But I've been very aware of the importance of another issue, which ties into what you were just saying about a sort of global climate justice issue, and particularly the way the wealthier nations use their resources, their financial power and their political power, not only to help alleviate the issues facing poorer people from climate change, but actually to help them with green development. How does that work for yourself?
Yeah, it really is an issue of justice. We know that the vast majority of the emissions that have been produced by the world's richest nations, by us, and yet it is the poorest people who are suffering the most. And it's the poorest people who are the ones who aren't producing the emissions that are causing the problems. So part of what we're looking at COP and part of the discussions is also around how we can be repairing some of that damage. So it's being talked about in the language of loss and damage, climate finance, how can there is an onus on those of us, on the richer nations, to be stumping up the cash, to put it bluntly, to be helping the poorer nations to recover and to be able to respond, not to recover, but to be able to respond to the emergency that they're facing. So this is very much a question of justice as well as other issues, and is one of the reasons why we're here at Tearfund, really calling on the British government and on other governments to take meaningful action, because we hear every day the impact that the climate crisis is having on the people in the communities that we serve. And so we have a responsibility to help them and to respond.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I would remember I was at a meeting the other day where we were listening to a climate scientist, and he was talking about the long decay time of carbon in the atmosphere. And so, even though Britain is now doing quite a reasonable job at reducing its carbon footprint, we've still got 200 years of carbon footprint sitting up there causing global warming now. And I think there's a whole development issue here as well, isn't there? That, we have developed using carbon and left that massive footprint that is doing damage now, even 200 years later. And then we have to say, well, what's the alternative for the less developed parts of the world if we don't want them to follow our path?
Yeah, we have to enable poorer nations, the economically poorer nations, to leapfrog over fossil fuels. There may be some fossil fuels that are still available for them to use if we reduce enough, but primarily we need to leapfrog over fossil fuels and get onto renewable energy and renewable technology and more sustainable agriculture. So again, just using Tearfund as an example, some of the communities that we're working in, we're trying to pick up on this and respond to it. So we're enabling communities to be accessing solar energy, communities that aren't on the general grid. So providing them with solar energy and doing it in a way that the local community is trained in the technology, so they're not then dependent on outside companies. So when it breaks down, what do they do with it? When it breaks down, there are people there who are trained with it. So then you're helping to provide livelihoods as well as renewable energy. And we're working in farming and sustainable agriculture and really helping those nations and the communities to do that leapfrogging.
It's really helpful exploring that issue to do with COP26. I'm aware that there are a whole raft of other issues. I mean, what for you are the key issues that need to be discussed, and what would you like to see happen?
The key issues, well, the absolute key issue is countries putting together action plans that keep us within the safer limit of 1.5 degrees of warming. So just to explain where we're at with COP26, COP26 is building on the Paris Climate Agreement, the COP back then in 2015. And at 2015, that was the historic agreement where almost all of the nations of the world came together and agreed that they would work to keep levels of warming below 2 degrees, and preferably there was a real emphasis on below 1.5. And what was agreed there was that 5 years later, the countries would come with their action plans for how they were going to do that, what's called nationally determined contributions. I don't know why they call them crazy. Let's just call them action plans. So the countries were going to come back. They were given 5 years to work out, okay, we've made this agreement. How are we going to do it? So 5 years now, because of the pandemic, 6 years on, COP26 is the time when the countries are coming to put their action plans on the table. And together, we need all of those action plans to add up to warming that keeps us within 1.5. At the moment, those action plans are adding up to warming of about 2.7 degrees, and that is absolute disaster. So the really big top line thing for these couple of weeks is that we see those action plans adding up to no more than 1.5 degrees. Underlying that, another key issue that we've just touched on is the climate finance. So back in 2009, rich country governments promised that they would deliver $100 billion a year of climate finance to poorer countries. And they said they would do that within 10 years, well, by 2020. So that should have been delivered already. It probably isn't a huge surprise to you to hear that it hasn't been delivered and it's still outstanding. So we need that. We need it delivered. We need it promised. We need it delivered. But considering the idea was it would have been delivered already and now they would be delivering more, we need it not to be, oh yes, we've got to 100 billion. That now needs to be what they start from to deliver extra. So that climate finance is really key. And then around all of that, there are other issues around nature-based solutions. So stopping deforestation, regenerating the carbon sinks that we've got. So the focus on nature-based solutions too. But the real biggie is getting those action plans to together add up to no more than 1.5 degrees.
A question here, and I'm just thinking of people listening to us having this conversation, and you're talking about the difference between global warming of 1.5 and 2.5 degrees, and because most people are not climate scientists, what I'm guessing many people think of, well, it really doesn't make a difference much, does it? 1 degree? Why does it make a difference?
Yeah, I know it doesn't sound much, does it? We're currently at about 1.3 degrees. And what have we been seeing just this year? We have seen terrible heat wave in Canada that has killed, scientists reckon, about 1 billion, if you can just get this number, 1 billion marine creatures. We've seen floods in China. They say it's the worst flooding they've had in 1,000 years. We've seen flooding in Western Europe that has devastated communities and led tragically to deaths. Last year, we saw the terrible wildfires in Australia, which they think also killed possibly about 1 billion land animals. We've seen the wildfires in California. We've seen the hurricane just very recently in Haiti, increased extreme weather events all over the place. That's before we reach 1.5. So this is at about 1.3. Every fraction matters. So I don't want to give the impression that 1.5 is, oh, okay, if we get to 1.5, that's fine. That's still really horrendous. But the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is also extreme. So limiting warming to 1.5 instead of 2 would mean droughts would be halved and tropical cyclones reduced by 4 times. We think up to 420 million fewer people would experience extreme heat waves. 145 million fewer people in cities would be exposed to severe drought. So without action, climate change could push 132 million people further into poverty by 2030. So it's really important that we realise that, yes, in one sense, 1.5 is arbitrary, 2 degrees arbitrary. You know, you have to kind of choose figures. The key thing is that every degree of warming matters. So every degree that we can keep it limited by will reduce the suffering that poorer people and ultimately ourselves will face, and the wider natural world.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I think part of the thing, of course, is it's a whole cumulative effect, isn't it? So there's a build-up of stuff going on. It's not just like having an extra warm day that's happening. I think one of the other questions that occurs to me here that sometimes concerns me is that when we're talking about climate change, and because it really is urgent and there really is a crisis and stuff needs doing, that sometimes my fear is we might inadvertently, by over focusing or putting all of our focus on climate, actually ignore other ecological impacts. And there might be a danger that we inadvertently do harm in other ways.
Yeah, and climate is the biggie, but in many ways it's the tip of the iceberg, and we're facing other extreme issues as well. So it's very much linked in with climate, but not only caused by climate, is biodiversity loss and the destruction of the natural world through our activities. There was a UN report came out a couple of years ago, 2019, that showed that 66% of marine environments and 75% of land environments have been fundamentally altered because of human behaviour. And climate is part of that, but it's also development and agriculture and so on, and the changing of water courses and dams and a whole variety of different things. And that is leading to biodiversity loss on an unprecedented scale at the rate that it's happening. And the other big issue that was getting so much focus before the pandemic hit was plastic pollution. And the danger is that we forget about that the pandemic has made us forget about that, and we focus on the climate crisis as we need to, but forget that we're also facing the reality that as a world and as a species, we are drowning in plastic. And that is causing it's having devastating consequences in the marine environment in a way that's probably very familiar to most people because of Blue Planet 2 and we, Countryfile, and we see a lot about marine plastic pollution. One area that Tearfund has been looking at is the impact of plastic pollution on people living in poverty. So billions of people in the world today don't have access to proper waste management services. And that has a really terrible effect. I wonder if you can imagine where you live, if the council decided it wasn't going to collect your bins anymore. You could probably cope for 1 or 2 weeks, maybe up to a month. But it would start piling up. And then what would you do? You'd pile it up in the streets. It would go up and up and up. Maybe the only way you could get rid of it would be to burn it. Then that would cause terrible respiratory problems. I imagine it would attract a whole load of rats and they would bring in their own diseases. If you live in a tropical country, you have upturned plastic pots that collect water and they provide the perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes. You have an increase in malarial diseases. So there's a whole range of problems that come from mismanaged waste. And that's one of the areas we're looking at Tearfund, in particular communities helping develop some livelihood schemes around plastic collection that then turns it into products that can be sold and used. But yes, you're right, we're facing many other issues today as well.
Now, we're having this conversation as two Christians. We're both employed by Christian organizations. I think it's very easy sometimes to see these kind of issues as things that some people are enthusiastic about. But why are you, as a Christian, involved in these kind of issues? How does this connect with your faith?
It connects totally with my faith, and really goes to the heart of who I believe God is. It goes to the heart of the God who I worship. And when I look in the scriptures, I see there a picture of a God who acts on behalf of people living in poverty and calls his people to do the same. So he calls us to spend ourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed. There are many Psalms that I could point you to. Psalm 113 is one of my favourite. That's this amazing hymn of praise to God. But there's one characteristic about God that the psalmist focuses on, and I haven't got it in front of me, so I won't quote it right. But it's about how God lifts the needy from the ash heap and from the dust. And that's the God we worship. I worship a God of justice who calls me to focus my life on helping others in need. And you see that not only in the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, but right through into the New Testament as well. It calls me to be a neighbour. I'm to be a neighbour to those who are suffering, to those who've been beaten up and left on the side of the road. And I also worship a God who is the creator of this world and who loves it. This world isn't something that's just second rate and rubbish and we're kind of waiting to get somewhere else. This world is absolutely precious to God. Jesus is the Lord of all creation. Colossians 1:15-20 is a passage in the New Testament that talks about how this world has been made in Jesus and by Jesus and for Jesus, almost like a present to Jesus. So when we look at the climate crisis and we see how it's impacting both people living in poverty and the wider natural world, I see there that as a Christian, I cannot worship a God of justice without getting involved in the climate justice. In the climate crisis, I cannot worship a creator God who loves this world and who calls us to take care of it without being involved in the biggest issue that is destroying this world. So it is, and there's much more, Steve, there's much more that I could say about that. But for me, it's right at the heart of my faith.
Thank you. I mean, one of the things that, you talked there about not waiting to go to another place. And I think there are some issues here for us as Christians in how we do our theology, how we think about what we believe God is doing in the world that matter here. And I certainly have been very struck by the idea of Paul talking about a new creation, but actually using a word in Greek for new that means the same one renewed, not a replacement. And that idea, that phrase that often surfaces at the moment in climate stuff about there is no planet B, is actually very much at the heart of a Christian understanding. But I know that sometimes Christians have been accused of being part of the problem. There's a famous or infamous paper that goes right back to the 1960s by an environmentalist called Lynn White, called the Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, in which he blamed Christianity for creating a dualism between humans and creation. And I sometimes fear when I listen to stuff about climate change that it's all focused on humans. Is there something in that critique of Lynn White?
In one sense, yes, of course. That's a critique that could be levelled not only at Christians, but at all humans. Interestingly, Lynn White, I think, sometimes gets worse press than he deserves. He actually was a person of faith himself, and he finishes his essay not by saying, therefore, Christianity is rubbish, so we should all reject it, but that actually we need a new St. Francis and we need a fresh understanding of Christianity that reflects some of the historic understandings of Christianity that we've seen through the centuries, that have seen how humans and the wider natural world are intricately connected, and that we have a role in taking care of the wider world. So I think all of us as people, whether Christians or people of other faith or of no faith, we have all been guilty of not taking care of this world. I might lay the blame more actually at the thinking of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution than at the feet of Christianity. And I think it's through some of the Enlightenment thinking of people like Bacon and others who saw animals as machines and didn't think animals had any feelings, or but they weren't sentient beings. They and the land were just there to be used and abused. So I think that's much more harmful than anything that's come through the Christian faith. So, we're all guilty in different ways, and we have to acknowledge that and move forward.
I mean, Ruth, we're coming, I think, into our last minutes here, but it might be really helpful for you to offer some pointers for people who are listening to this, who say, well, what can I do to make a difference in the world? And I reckon that happens at all sorts of different levels. So you may want to start by saying, what do you hope as an advocate for a charity to achieve at COP26? But then some ideas that we might do, as people living our lives, both as influencers and in our lifestyles.
Yeah. So what our big hope, of course, is linked to the points that I talked about earlier, particularly around seeing the action plans keeping us within the safer limits of 1.5. And that's really what we're working towards. Whether we'll get there or not, we don't know, but that's what we're working towards. And also using this opportunity to help Christians and the church engage more around climate and issues of poverty and environmental breakdown. In terms of what people can do, I often talk about us standing in the gap. We're called to give, to act, and to pray. And I think those are helpful ways that we can think through how we can respond in our own lives. So unapologetically, let's give, let's use our money. Those of us who've been blessed with money, let's give it and be generous. Let's give it to organisations and others who are working and helping in this area. And let's think about the money that we keep too, the money that we invest just in our banks or in our pensions, and make sure they're invested in good ways rather than in places that are themselves causing harm. So we can give. And then secondly, we can act. And I see that acting in two ways. So we can act in our own lives, the different lifestyle choices that we make. So that will be around thinking about the kind of food that we eat, eating much more vegetable and grain-based diet. Not everybody will want to go fully vegetarian or fully vegan, and that's absolutely fine. The key is reducing, so that we're eating less meat and a predominantly vegetable and grain-based diet. And for those of us who do want to eat meat, when we do, then let's eat meat from animals, from farmers that have been produced, reared by farmers who really care about their animals, because there are a lot of good farmers around and we want to support them. So there's other things we can do around food too, but thinking about our food, thinking about how we're making changes and how we travel, in the way that we produce energy at home, and then what we throw away, particularly our plastic. So we can give, we can act in terms of the individual lifestyle choices that we make, and they are all small, but they will add up and make a difference. And we can also act, and this is the really big thing, by calling on our governments and our authorities to be acting in ways that make a difference. So the big changes will be made by the big players, and we need to call on them to do those big changes. But we need to back that up with the changes in our own lives, otherwise we're being hypocritical, and those little actions will add up. So we give, we act in those two ways. And finally, I would call us to pray. And I would encourage everyone listening to this, even if you're not a person of faith, take some steps in prayer. It's my experience that prayer does change situations. And looking back to the historic Paris Agreement, I spoke a little while ago with a woman called Christiana Figueres, who was one of the architects, one of the key global players of the Paris Agreement. And she said to me, just while we were chatting, she said to me, without the faith communities, there would be no Paris Agreement. Because we worked together, we did pilgrimages, we prayed. The Paris Agreement, I really believe, was an answer to prayer. So I think the final thing that we can all do, whether you're a person of faith or not, you could take some tiny steps in this. Pray, and let's together move some mountains.
You remind me of a quote I think I want to finish on, which is from the climate scientist Gus Speth, who said after 20 years of working on technologies and stuff, he realized that the real issue was about greed, avarice, and apathy, and that what we really needed was a spiritual and cultural transformation. And that's, I think, it's very much at the heart of what faith contributes in this area. Ruth, thank you very much for joining us in Glasgow. Just really hope and pray that the conference goes well, and we look forward to hearing more from you as things develop.
Thank you. Really good to talk with you today.